Welcome to the By Way of Commandment podcast, a podcast dedicated to the study of the gospel of Jesus Christ and the finer points of his doctrine. Join us as we study the gospel through the scriptures and standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Welcome back, everyone, to the By Way of Commandment podcast. I am your host, as always, Jacob Ryder. Today, I am joined by a very special guest. You may know him from the channel on YouTube, LDS Philosopher Joseph Lawal. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
That was very good.
Awesome. Excellent. So, Joseph, you are currently at Yale. Is that correct? And you're studying philosophy?
Yeah, I'm doing my PhD currently. Yeah.
Excellent. And how much longer do you have of your program?
I'm just finishing up my first year. So the average at Yale is about 6 years for a philosophy PhD.
Okay. So you still got quite a ways to go.
Ways to go. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I finished my master's degree about 2 years ago, and it was a 3-year program.
Oh, yeah.
And I felt like 2 years in, I still couldn't quite see the light at the end of the tunnel. It wasn't until that last semester that I could start to see it.
Right.
But you've got
Yes.
quite a ways to go.
Several years left.
So tell me a little bit about the program you're in and what exactly it is you're studying.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, philosophy PhD in the States tends to consist of like a couple of years of coursework, and then you'll kind of work on your dissertation for the rest of the time, and often you'll do some teaching or TFing or TAing as well. And so yeah, I'll do 2 years of coursework. That's what I'm working on now, and then a dissertation. My research is primarily in contemporary. Well, I'll do a little bit of history of philosophy. That's the way often philosophers will divide up what you kind of work on, whether it's contemporary and then a particular issue or history of philosophy. So I do some history of analytic philosophy, which is basically philosophy since about 1900 in the Anglophone world, roughly, and some early modern philosophy. And then on contemporary issues, which is what I primarily work on, it's like the intersection of philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, metaphysics, epistemology. That's kind of roughly. I mean, it's basically I work on a lot of what I do is inspired by a guy called Hilary Putnam. He's my favorite philosopher, and his work. I have kind of particular interest in particular parts of his work, and it intersects a lot of areas, which is why I have to list so many when I say what I work on.
So there's a lot of big words there. I think we'll get into those as we get into our discussion here.
Yeah.
But I want to kind of bring on someone like yourself to really break down what is this thing we call philosophy. And on the channel here, we've been doing the lectures on faith. So I'm doing
nice.
an episode of each of the individual lectures. We're going to get through all 7. It's very clear to me that this is maybe the earliest attempt at putting together a cohesive theology of what the Latter-day Saint Church believes, at least certainly in the early days of the church.
Yeah.
But it's clear that Joseph Smith and many of the other early leaders of the church were not philosophers. They were not theologians. There were a handful who were classically trained or who were, trained at a university to be a theologian in some respects. We might think of like the Orson Pratt was probably one of those who are more trained. Sidney Rigdon was a little bit more academically trained. But by and large, most of the members of the church at that time, including Joseph, were not philosophers. And so we have a very interesting history as a church insofar as we are only really now, I think, in the 20th century and 21st century kind of starting to break ground into the philosophy world and try and better understand our own beliefs through a philosophical lens. Whereas prior, we didn't have that. And even if we look back in the early days of Christianity, the first several centuries, it took a while to kind of gather enough theologically and philosophically minded individuals within Christianity to kind of put together their best arguments for things like Christology, things like cosmology, these things that we'll talk about a little bit more today. So we're kind of a very young religion. And so we're just now starting to get into this world of philosophy as a church. with thinkers like, I would say probably right in the earlier days of the church, we'd have like the Pratt brothers, Sidney Rigdon, and a few others. But going on into the 20th century, we have individuals like, I would even consider Talmage to be a little bit more theologically minded. We would have Truman G. Madsen,
Woodson
and
and Widsoe and Roberts, right, and Chamberlain. He was probably our first actually trained philosopher. Was W. H. Chamberlain, who was right at the beginning of the 20th century. So anyone before that, even Orson Pratt, who was a very good, very interesting philosopher, he was almost entirely self-taught. Well, he was, in philosophy entirely self-taught. And so you get, it's our trained philosophers is like 100 years old. This is about as old as we get with trained philosophy in the church. So
yeah,
you're
not
right
very
that
long.
it's
Oh, there you are. Okay. Yeah, not very long. We really have only kind of been in the more academically trained realm of philosophy probably in since the 20th century. And so
yeah, that's right.
we've got a long ways to go before we kind of can really build out what it is, philosophically speaking, we can understand about our own faith. And um but we're going to kind of break down some of this philosophy, and I want to look at specifically today this thing that's called classical theism. So we'll break down kind of the general worldview of Christian philosophy, and then maybe towards the end we can start to contrast that with Latter Day Saint view. Um, but can you give us just kind of a brief introduction? What exactly is philosophy and theology? Are they just the synonymous? Are they two separate things? What's the difference between philosophy and theology when we want to make some argument for the existence of God or a consciousness or whatever it is that we're going to be discussing? Uh, we have these different terms, and I think it's helpful if we understand what it is that we're talking about.
Yeah, so there is overlap between philosophy and theology, but not very much. So most philosophy has nothing to do with theology, and substantial portions of, well, I say nothing to do. It's clearly not theology, and much of what theology is doing is not always kind of interest to philosophers, even theologically minded ones. So, uh, almost I would say any just about any doctrine that we would talk about in the church, I think properly belongs to theology, right? Just, I mean, the etymology is, the study of God, but I think we might think of like the gathering of Israel is a doctrine in theology, right? Or you might want to restrict it a little bit more and say when we talk about the nature of God, the priesthood, that sort of thing is going to fall within the realm of theology. And then on the other hand, philosophy, I mean, there are different ways of breaking it down, but people often will break it down into the kind of theoretical side and the applied side, or you might, well, I mean, yes. So on the theoretical side, you have things like logic, so that study of the laws of logic and reasoning, valid and sound arguments, that sort of thing. Metaphysics, which is the study of kind of what exists and what the nature of what exists is. So it's very broad. And within that, you might include things like philosophy of mind, so the nature of the mind, consciousness. But so yeah, the kind of, I guess you might list the big five areas of philosophy as logic, metaphysics, and epistemology, which is the study of knowledge and truth on the theoretical side, and then maybe like aesthetics, the study of beauty, art kind of stuff, and ethics on the other. And then you have kind of smaller areas that you probably want to mention, like political philosophy, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, right? So that's philosophy, and then kind of within that, you can have kind of philosophical theology, right? So when you talk about the nature of God, philosophers and theologians are both going to want to do that, and maybe they'll sometimes do that in different ways. But you see certainly people working in the intersection. Philosophy of religion is an area of philosophy, and so when you're debating things like arguments for the existence of God, natural theology, the nature of God. If we talk about classical theism, it's very people are very comfortable saying, sure, that's kind of within the province of both philosophy and theology. And so for Latter-day Saints, I think there's lots of interest that we have to say that impacts even the non-theological part of philosophy. But by and large, qua Latter-day Saint, you're going to be interested in kind of philosophical theology or philosophy of religion. And so I take it that's largely what we'll be discussing today.
Yeah, thank you for that breakdown. I think it's oftentimes in the church, I think the only real time we hear philosophy is this idea of the philosophies of men mingled with scripture, and
Yes.
that's a very famous phrase that we'll hear, particularly within the temple context. Um,
But it's got a negative connotation, right? So I think
right,
people tend to associate kind of disvalue philosophy on those grounds alone. And I think one of the important things that philosophers like to say sometimes is that everyone's doing philosophy in some sense, right? So like when you have a position about what it is to have a mind, or what a person is, or what justice is, these are philosophical questions. And so it's not to say that like, yeah, we have to mingle philosophy with scripture, but like I think most philosophers would say, sure, like the kind of worldview you have is informed by or presupposes philosophical positions. So it's, yeah, the kind of encroach, the perceived encroachment of academics on doctrine is, I mean, you can think that's a problem and still be perfectly fine with people doing philosophy, right? You might just think, you need to orient yourself such that you start with scripture and then do the philosophy or something. But I think that like opposition to philosophy period is a mistake. I do think that.
so if we're talking about philosophy as it pertains to particular theological position or faith tradition, we're going to be spending most of our time discussing like what is God, what's the nature of God, how can we know of God's existence, what is our
Yeah.
relationship to God, and what does that mean for who we are, what we are as humankind, as individuals. These are some of these really big questions that need to be answered, and or we have a desire to answer them. And so we're going to go about answering these in a theological path. And so if we start our discussion, I think would be a good idea to start with what is classical theism.
Yeah.
So in I think we'll break this down into building out what is classical theism and contrast that with more specific um, theological frameworks, particularly a Latter Day Saint framework. But um, for myself and all the listeners included, what exactly is this thing called classical theism? What are we
So
talking about?
yeah, so classical theism, I mean, there's always going to be dispute, but I would say roughly it's supposed to be something like the picture of God that underlies the Abrahamic faith. So it's not just a Christian thing. I think there are Muslims and Jews who are going to endorse classical theism, and so it's a certain kind of conception of God. It's not one that actually we accept. Latter-day Saints, I think, it'd be very difficult as Latter-day Saint to accept classical theism. I think that the outline of the views that constitute classical theism. So yeah, it's basically a set of attributes that you're gonna say God has. So simplicity is a big part of it. God is absolutely simple. He has no parts of any kind. He's transcendent, which means he's outside space and time. You're almost always going to add on the omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient, although those aren't distinctive of classical theism. And then you have things like immutability, meaning God can't change, impassibility, meaning God is not affected by creation, particularly in feeling passions. Um, am I missing any? Immutability, impassibility, simplicity, transcendence. Yeah, those and then like aseity, often God is causally independent of anything else. Those are kind of the distinctive features of classical theism. And I think any listener who's familiar with the Latter-day Saint conception of God is going to have noticed problems there, right? Even if you're not familiar with these terms, we don't accept that God is outside space. Certainly, maybe time is up in the air. We don't think that God is impassible. We think God can feel emotions. The God who weeps, right, is the name of one of Taylor and Fiona Given's books, because in our scripture it talks about God weeping. God is changeable in the sense that like he can have different states, right? He can think one thing in one moment and one thing another moment. That would violate immutability on the classical conception. And God's complex. He's got a body, therefore he's in space, and he can't be totally simple, right? So I think we're going to disagree with much of what's distinctive about classical theism.
Yeah, probably just about all of it in some way, shape, or form is going to be very different than our own position. Um, so let's talk for a minute about what it means for God to be simple. There's a couple different views out there that I've read about simple versus complex. When you say that God is simple, what exactly does that mean? Um, and then we'll kind of break down some of the implications of some of these other aspects and attributes that you laid out.
So for the classical theist, simplicity, I mean, there are different views of simplicity, and there will be different strengths of the view. But something like God doesn't have any proper parts. Often it's going to mean as well that his essence is identical to his existence, which is part of his kind of not it's impossible for God to fail to exist on that picture. But I think one of the more radical sides of it, and something not all advocates of divine simplicity will accept this, but many will, is the idea that because God's simple, his attributes have to be identical to one another. So his, say, omnipotence has to be the same thing as his omniscience. So when I say I'm able to do something, I'm able to lift my arm in the air, and I know that there's a laptop in front of me, those are two kind of different facts about me. And my capacity, my attributes, the fact that I can know things, the fact that I can do something, I have the power to do something, are distinct things about me. And in God, they can't be. There has to be the same attribute, his knowing and his being able to do things. And so that already sounds very strange, and so that's why divine simplicity is often seen as leading pretty much immediately to this thing called the doctrine of analogy, this idea that what we say about God isn't univocally kind of like literally true, right? So if I say that a hamburger is good or a person is good, that can't mean quite the same thing as it does in God. It has to be an analogy. So it's something like good in the sense that we mean it, but it can't mean the same thing because God's simple, and so his goodness is identical to his power and his omniscience and his immutability, right? And in us, obviously, our goodness is not identical to our power. It's kind of strange to think what that would mean. I think one of the big weaknesses of classical theism is this doctrine of analogy, simplicity stuff is really tricky.
Yeah, it seems like there's not a very straightforward way of sort of parsing those out and how we would define them. Where's the cutoff or the threshold um, of these different components or attributes, and being simple that they're all the same is really very strange for us as humans to comprehend because as you mentioned, you know that the computer's in front of you and you can also raise your arm. They're not inherently the same thing.
It's hard to work out what that would mean, right?
Exactly. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So we would have to spend a lot of time just focused on that one attribute and what that really means and how we can even conceptualize that in a way that we would understand to some degree. And so one of the things you mentioned is God's kind of self-existence. That it's this idea. I think we could reform that to basically just say that God of necessity must exist.
Yeah.
And that he is self-existent. Even in the Hebrew scriptures, Yahweh, the name that I am, right? It's this acknowledgement of the self-existent one. And so we would even agree as Latter-day Saints that to some degree of necessity, there is a higher being, a higher power, and we classify him as God. And we give him different names, or we even believe that he has given himself different names for us to call him by.
Yeah.
But there is this idea that he is the self-existent one, and if he did not exist, then basically I think the argument would be that nothing else would exist. Is that correct?
Often, certainly for classical theists, I think for Latter-day Saints, you can make that argument, but given kind of our history, it's not clear that we should necessarily. So, like, maybe to make it clear exactly what we mean when we say God is necessary, right? So you think basically this is kind of in philosophy known as modality, this idea of kind of things being possible or impossible, necessary or not necessary, right? And so like I'm raising my arm right now. I could have chosen not to do that. So it's a kind of a contingent fact that I raised my arm. It was not necessary because it could have been otherwise, right? And so like I exist, it looks like contingently, because if my parents had never met, which is possible, then I wouldn't have existed. I mean, obviously there's complications there in terms of like pre-existence, but that's something we might ordinarily say is that I might not have existed because it could have been otherwise. And so the idea with God is that he couldn't have failed to exist, right? So unlike whatever this laptop that I'm sitting in front of, it could have not been created at all. God couldn't fail to exist. That's certainly true of the classical theist picture. And then I think for Latter-day Saints, we're going to be pretty happy to affirm that, I think, a lot of the time, right? That God couldn't have failed to exist in some sense. Maybe, if you accept the picture where God at one time was a man and became God, maybe it's not necessary that he is God. Maybe that could have been otherwise. But I think we'll be happy to say that beings like God are necessary.
Yeah, and I would even think that someone like Blake Ostler has a particular view of that specific um, uh, I don't know if you want to call that a doctrine or what,
Sure.
because
Or at
I
least a
don't.
kind of a purported doctrine, right? If we think
Sure,
doctrines couldn't be wrong, then maybe it's not a doctrine, depending if you think it's right or wrong, right?
right, and this idea that God became man and then ascended afterwards, and that Jesus essentially fulfilled that same pattern.
Yeah.
um there's a couple different views here. I think most people, and we won't get all into this today, but I think most people in the church today have adopted the, I guess we would call it the infinite regression model, that God has a God who has a God, or father to father to father, so on for eternity.
Yeah.
And so the God that we worship as our heavenly Father uh, basically did the same thing Jesus did. He came down to an earth and took upon himself a physical temporal body, and then was resurrected, and so on. And Jesus is fulfilling that same pattern, and that's what we're all doing. He's showing us how to fulfill that same pattern. And um, Blake Ostler has a very different view, and I tend to lean towards his view, which is he calls it kingship monotheism or monarchical monotheism,
Hmm.
which is that God the Father is God the Father. There was no Father before him, but he is the head God in the grand council of gods, that he basically at one point did come to an earth so that he could take on a physical temporal form and experience this thing called life, much the same way that Jesus did, but that he did exist and is the self-existent, self-exalted one
Yeah.
who existed prior to that for eternity as God. And so there was never a point in which he was not God. And so there's a very different view, and we can talk about that another time. But I think this goes back to the main topic. I think that this brings up is this idea of God being self-existent, and what does that mean for God to be of necessity, or to of necessity be existent, and what the implications of that are for all of creation, including the universe, us, what our purpose is in life. There's um, these are kind of big questions that arise when you have this idea that God of necessity must exist. Um, and in classical theism, as I understand it, this brings on a lot of baggage. I think one of the aspects that this would bring up is the idea of creation ex nihilo, or creatio ex nihilo.
Hmm.
Creation out of nothing is kind of really built on this idea uh, of the necessity of God's existence, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
So, oh, sorry. Sorry. Go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was gonna say, yeah, it's that's right. It's like if you're a classical theist, you're gonna think probably that God's the only self-existent thing. I mean, not necessarily. You might think maybe laws of logic or numbers or something exist necessarily as well. But I think often classical theists will not even want to grant that much. God's the only necessarily existent thing, and then he chooses freely to create creation, right? The universe, all of us, everything that's in the universe, right? Time itself. Often classical theists will say God created. And so God then is the only necessary thing. And in fact, there are arguments from contingency, the fact that we exist contingently, there has to be something that exists necessarily to ground that, and that's going to be God. And so then, yeah, that's almost going to guarantee you creation ex nihilo, right? The universe didn't exist, and then God created it out of nothing, right? So for us, we don't. It looks like we can't believe in creation ex nihilo because Joseph Smith said that the elements are eternal, right? They've always existed. And so if we think that God exists of necessity, it looks like we're probably also going to say the universe exists of necessity, right? It wasn't created. I mean, there's some dispute there. You might think that the universe has always existed, but that kind of eternal chain of the universe could have failed to exist. It's not necessary that it exists, even though it, as a matter of fact, has always existed. I think it's plausible that if we're going to endorse an eternal universe, to say that the universe exists necessarily. There are different models of how to model that in kind of modal logic, but that's we don't need to get into that.
Sure. So we have a God who exists outside of time and space, who is, at least in this view, immaterial, um, which to me always rubbed me a little wrong, because the idea that there was at some point before he decided to create everything, before he decided to create our universe. Um,
Before too, right? Because
right,
there was no
that
time, so
right.
it's
This
not like
this
temporally indexed. Yeah,
this doesn't make a whole lot of sense to the finite mind,
sure.
especially one like me who is not particularly well versed in these big topics. But it always was very difficult for me to understand how this could be when we have a before. There was at some point when our world, at least, even according to modern science, did not always exist. Our planet is the result of a chain of events that happened across billions and even trillions of years.
Hmm.
And so there was a point in which the planet we live on, even humanity, all living things on this planet, there was a point that we can kind of trace our existence back to under there's differing views of the Big Bang Theory, but in modern science, that's kind of the widely accepted. Generally speaking, is widely accepted as being kind of our origin story as a planet, as a
Hmm.
universe. And so, under this model, there is of necessity a point at which we did not exist that we sprang forth out of. And so, um, to have this idea that God exists outside of time, space, who is immaterial, to create things ex nihilo, this brings on a lot of ideas that we could go into. I think creation ex nihilo is the kind of the big, I guess, theological um, discussion behind our creation in a classical theist view.
Yeah.
Um, I have a few things that I've toyed around with and have been uh, thinking about in terms of creation ex nihilo versus a Latter day Saint perspective of creation ex materia, I think is what we would refer to it as.
Yeah.
But in any case, um, in this particular classical theist view of God as the self-existent one who of necessity exists, um, and from him all things were created. This includes things like the laws of nature, it includes time, as you mentioned. It even includes things like ethics or well, I think we could in Latter Day Saint terminology we would call them like celestial laws or eternal laws that govern morality um, and all things. It's kind of the all encompassing laws that govern reality, and so it's not just physical laws of nature, but it includes things like ethics or morals as well. And so we have in a, a generally Christian worldview that falls in this umbrella of classical theism. God is the one who creates all of these laws. He creates the laws of nature. He creates time. He creates morality. Whatever God has declared is truth. And
Yeah, well,
so,
sorry, just a quick. So like, yes, I think many classical theory. Well, I don't know about many anymore, actually. So meta ethics is the view like of kind of like what makes moral facts true, basically, and that's not my area, even in philosophy. So I do some philosophy of religion, but I don't do that kind of part of philosophy of religion. So I'm not sure what the kind of big view amongst classical theists is as to what the nature of morality is. Certainly, there are people who accept a divine command theory, some form of it, wherever whatever God commands is what's good, essentially. But I don't think you're not committed to saying that God creates moral law as a classical theist, but I think it's a natural thing to say. But like I said, that we have a bit more wiggle room. Maybe what's moral is kind of a part of nature, or maybe it's grounded in our natures, kind of an Aristotelian view, or maybe God commands whatever is good, right? I think we have a lot more wiggle room. Well, it's easier to see why we might have wiggle room than you would in a classical theist picture. But I do want to point out that I don't think you're necessarily committed to saying God creates the moral law, even though you are going to think that God created like natural laws, like gravitation, that sort of thing. God could have made that difference. Maybe you don't think God could have made the laws of nature different on the classical theist picture, even.
okay, no, that's good because some of the things that I've read, um, and like I mentioned last time we spoke, I mean, I'm really new to this, to
Sure.
studying philosophy and studying specifically the theological components of philosophy. And so um, the kind of the my natural um, the my natural inclination is that if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C, and so you have this idea of self-existent God who creates ex nihilo. It would kind of make sense. Then the pattern would follow that um, everything else would come from his creation, like time,
Sure.
time, matter, but also things like ethics, you call it the divine command theory. Is that the correct
So that's
term?
where it's contingent on his will, right? And so one
Okay, yeah,
alternative, which is why you might not quite want to say that God creates. So like in terms of creating the world, like I don't know, it's not quite true to say this because the time issue is tricky, but it's something like there was a time when there was just God and then there was creation or something. And you might not think that even that picture, even with the tricky time stuff, is true of the moral side because you might think that God's nature is goodness. So divine command theory, what's good is dependent on God's will, roughly. But alternative pictures might be that it's just dependent on his nature. What God is good or something, right? And there's kind of what's called the Euthyphro dilemma, really tricky stuff here, essentially. But you might it kind of looks like if it's dependent on his nature, there's a sense in which it's not created, even though it's dependent on God. It's not quite the same as like the law of gravitation, which kind of comes to be because of God's will, which that wouldn't apply. That's basically that's what I want to emphasize that distinction. Where I think you can definitely say I think kind of plausibly it's dependent on God, but not like created in the same way that other laws of nature might be, right?
sure. No, that makes a lot more sense. A difference between God commanding something to be so and something to be so because it's part of his nature. That
Exactly. Yeah,
there's a
that's the
distinction.
Euthyphro
Yeah.
dilemma. Yeah, that's you've captured that nicely. Yeah.
Okay. No, that makes a lot more sense because sometimes when I read through some articles online or whatever talking about some of these aspects, they kind of blend the two,
Oh, sure. Yeah.
and so it can be difficult to parse out. So I'm glad that you kind of mentioned that because that makes a lot more sense under this view, I think.
It's tricky for Latter-day Saints as well, right? I mean, I think I think like naturally, if you don't think about these things at like the explicitly philosophical level, like really laying out what you're thinking about, I think it's very natural to kind of go back and forth between the two views, right? That like whatever God says is good, and I'm going to do whatever God says, right? And he could will anything or something, right? I think that's many people have that kind of standard picture. But on the other hand, you have things like in Second Nephi where it talks about if God were not just, he would cease to be God, and that kind of makes it seem like maybe there's things outside of God, like kind of standards that he's meeting, and if he fails to meet them, he would cease to be God. So that looks like it wouldn't be contingent on him, but there are ways you could kind of read that as being contingent on him. So yeah, I think as Latter-day Saints, we often kind of can flip back and forth quite naturally between views like those, and so it's good to be conscious of these things because I think it's good to try to work out what the most plausible account is for Latter-day Saints. Should we think that what is moral is dependent on God's will, or should we think that God's will is moral because he's conforming it to what is moral, right?
Right. One point that I think would be interesting to point out. We don't have to go into this, but when we talk about time, the creation of time, time is very interesting to think about, and I think when we understand that our universe is expanding, matter is expanding, energy is expanding. This thing called entropy, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
um, everything in our universe is constantly expanding. It's kind of we could look at it as almost like a flower in blossom or blooming, where it's continually growing outward. Um, and so I think most scientists today would describe our universe in these terms of entropy and heat and energy and matter constantly expanding. And
Yeah.
so if we're going to talk about the creation of matter, creation of our universe, then to me it follows that time came after that, or that time came as a result of the
Mm-hmm.
creation of matter, because when you have matter and energy that are expanding, and now you have uh matter that is kind of like our universe is in orbit around other universes, and within our galaxy we have planets that are in orbit around one another,
Mm-hmm.
around the sun. And so time is really only a measurement of entropy and our motion around the universe, and as matter expands, as energy expands. And so I just kind of as we're talking, like that's starting to click a little bit more for me. That okay, so if matter is being created by God, then and it's expanding, then it only follows that time is the result of the creation of matter, not necessarily the other way around, or not necessarily distinct and separate from matter. Would that be kind of an accurate representation?
Yeah, so I think the kind of scientific conception of time is not always kind of intuitive or natural to us. And so you're right that, like, I think science, I mean, this is not my area in philosophy, and I don't know a ton about the science, but you're right that, like, scientists see basically the direction of entropy as I don't know, determining the flow of time, right? So if entropy were reversed, the flow of time would be as well. And so, yeah, so like I think the link between time and space is not something that we kind of notice, but scientists tell us that's what happens, right? Curvature in space changes time and that sort of thing. And so, yeah, so on the Latter-day Saint side, what that means is I think it's hard to say God is embodied but isn't in time, because if you think about it's if you have a scientific understanding of what time and space are, they're not separable. There's time space, right? You've probably heard that term before. And so, yeah, if you think about like God has a body, let's say his body's here and then it's over here. Well, what is motion? It's just change in location over time. And so it's tricky to see that on that side. On the classical theist side, yeah, I think you're right that it looks like God creates space and kind of along with it time that kind of follows with his creation of space. Yeah. And so, I mean, obviously there's a tricky question of what it means to be outside time. And, this is not the only option, right? So there's this kind of scientific conception of time. There are some philosophers who want to resist that. I mean, there's kind of reasons, lots of reasons, but one thing is Einstein showed us it looked like that there's no absolute simultaneity, right? So two things, we take any two events, are they happening at the same time? Well, you can't just say that absolutely. It's relative to a frame of reference. And some people don't like that, right? And so they want to say there's like a metaphysical time that does determine whether any two events are simultaneous or not. You don't have to have a frame of reference for it. And there's the kind of physical time on top of it. So there's ways of resisting the kind of scientific conception of time. But I think it's not a popular way, even amongst philosophers. I think many want to accept just the kind of scientific conception of what time is.
Yeah, and I apologize for leading the witness, but I was kind of being a little bit facetious there with my description of time relative to matter, and what that would imply for a classical theist view of God, and a more Latter Day Saint perspective of God, because we would accept that if God has a physical body, he has a body that is made up of matter. That means that of necessity he can only exist in one point at any one given time, because time is contingent upon its relativity to matter.
Yeah.
Um,
I'm
so
also drawn to that view. Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think the big complication for Latter-day Saints is going to be foreknowledge, omniscience, right? So, like, one advantage of the classical theist picture, God is outside time. He can see everything that's going to happen. There's no worry about, like, does God know the future? How can prophecy happen? His providence, can he handle like different events happening such that his plans still come to fruition? And for Latter-day Saints, we also want to say, I think quite naturally, God knows the future. And that's trickier, I think, if you think God's inside time. I think that's going to be the worry. I think any Latter-day Saint who's going to resist God being outside time is likely going to do it along kind of those lines, that they want to really ensure God has foreknowledge, even if it's at the expense of, having a kind of weird, maybe anti-scientific view of time, or like philosophical on top of the scientific view of time. Because I think you're right that if we say God's inside space, it's very hard to avoid the conclusion that he's also inside time, right?
yeah, it would be very difficult to sort of divide that out. I don't see how we could do that in a very neat way.
No, me
that,
neither. Yeah.
that would be a little too messy to try and parse out, and I don't think, given my very limited understanding of these things, I don't see any way of doing that in a very organizational, clean way, and so it would be too messy to parse out. But we this does bring up an issue that you mentioned, is how can God have foreknowledge of things to occur in the future if he exists inside of time and space? And so, in the classical theistic view, to go back to that, we have a God that exists outside of time and space. And so the concept of understanding past, present, and future isn't a difficult one. He exists outside of all of that, and so he could view and know through his absolute foreknowledge all things.
Yeah.
It's all present before him, and I think we would even point to maybe a couple scriptures in the New Testament as well, that if not downright say it, then at least imply that this is the case, that God has the ability to kind of see all things
Yeah.
at once and play around with time at his will.
Yeah. So I think this is one of the trickier points for Latter-day Saints, because on the one hand you want to preserve I think we have a tendency to want to preserve foreknowledge. We'd like to think that God knows everything. Although I say that, but like historically there's been dispute, right? Orson Pratt was very pro God having foreknowledge, but Brigham Young was not, right? He thought God learns things. I think it was part of his kind of conception of God as always progressing, eternally progressing. I think now church leaders tend to see, at least kind of that's the sense I get from General Conference, they tend to think that God knows the future in the way that maybe Orson Pratt did, right? Certainly like, Elder McConkie thought that. So I think it's shifted that way. So basically the tension tends to be between foreknowledge on the one hand and our freedom on the other. So if you're a determinist, if you think that all of our actions are causally determined, then it's very easy to see how God might know the future. You're probably going to think that if God knows the current situation of everything and the laws of nature, because those two things together determine all of the future, God can know that future. That's very easy. But many people think that causal determinism of that kind is incompatible with free will. So-called incompatibilists. So that if you're an incompatibilist who believes in free will, you're a libertarian, is the term that philosophers use. So libertarians about free will, again, think that things can't be causally determined and we also be free. And so if things aren't causally determined, it's no longer clear how God knows the future, particularly if you think God's inside time, right? So like maybe one thing you might think is God knows us really, really well. So even if we have libertarian free will, he's like really good at guessing, essentially. But it's like, it's not guessing because he has a lot of information, but it's not going to be absolute certainty. Maybe we can surprise God by exercising our libertarian free will on this picture. And so this is kind of moving towards an open theist picture, which Blake Ostler endorses, right? This idea that the future is open to God. We have libertarian free will, and so God doesn't know with absolute certainty what's going to happen in the future. And he's still providentially still working within time. We still want to preserve things like prophecy because we think that people in the past predicted things about the future or prophesied things about the future. And so you want some kind of so it's tricky to call it foreknowledge because knowledge is factive, right? Knowledge, it's only counts as knowledge if it's true. If it turns to be false, it wasn't knowledge. So that's why guessing is kind of the term you want to use. But guessing makes it sound like it's just like kind of almost arbitrary, right? It's like it's more or less tied to reasons. Anyway, this is tricky. But if you're a determinist or what's called a compatibilist, you think free will is compatible with determinism. It's very easy. God knows the future because it's determined. But many people are going to worry about free will there. And so that's the major tension for Latter-day Saints. They have to decide, do you think libertarian free will is compatible with foreknowledge? Some philosophers think that. And if not, are you going to give up libertarian free will or are you going to give up absolute foreknowledge? Right?
Yeah. So we even had a little quick back and forth earlier this week in a Facebook discussion about what creation ex nihilo implies for with this idea of absolute foreknowledge, what that implies for free will, and how much can we preserve one over the other?
Right.
How compatible are they? I tend to lean pretty heavily on the side that God cannot have absolute foreknowledge and be compatible with libertarian free will. I can see the argument for the other side, though I'm not convinced by it. But yeah, let's talk about that for a minute, because I think having a God that, to go back to the classical theistic view of a God that's outside time and space and has absolute foreknowledge of everything, this does kind of put a little bit of a question out there as to how much free will we actually have. How much he lets us make decisions and lets things fold out, and he just simply knows what's going to happen, versus he knows what's going to happen because he determines it to be so. There's a difference there. Can we kind of tease that out a little bit about what that means for free will?
Yeah. So one way to think about it is we think about Joseph Smith's translation of Genesis, where he talks about Joseph of Egypt prophesying that there would be another Joseph who restores the gospel, right? So this is thousands of years before Joseph Smith is even a twinkle in his great-great-great-great-grandfather's life. I mean, it's so far, right? Like Joseph Smith is not anywhere in the picture into terms of, obviously we think he was in the pre-existence, but He's not on Earth, right? Okay, so he's predicted now, or prophesied, according to this translation, by name. There's a guy called Joseph who's going to do a great work, right? Um, what does that mean? Does that mean that Joseph Smith came to Earth and didn't have a choice about restoring the gospel, right? Because it had to fulfill the prophecy? Or did it mean it was like really, really likely and we got lucky that Joseph Smith didn't? Because so like if we think he's free, you think, you know, on the one hand, he could have restored the gospel, on the other, he could have not restored the gospel. But then how does that work with that prophecy? If he didn't, you know, could a prophecy that God inspires someone to make fail? So like you might think the certain prophecy contingent, they say, you know, if the city is righteous, it will not be destroyed or something, and it gets destroyed, you think, oh, the prophecy wasn't true. Well, you know, you might just say, no, well, it just wasn't righteous, right? So the antecedent of the conditional wasn't met. But if it's just a prophecy that looks like it's just saying this guy Joseph is going to restore the gospel, yeah, it looks like that some people think that's going to call into question free will. If God knew, and God couldn't be wrong about the fact that Joseph Smith was going to do that, could Joseph Smith have done otherwise? That's the main tension, I think, right?
Right.
Yeah, does that? I've actually forgotten what your question was. Does that answer your
No.
question?
That describes, I think, kind of the position that I think a lot of people would take is um, uh, if God knew with 100% or absolute foreknowledge, because he determined it to be so, then that would mean that essentially Joseph Smith didn't have a choice in the matter. He was going to be born where he was going to be born.
Mhm.
He was going to make the decisions he did to eventually lead him into the sacred grove, to have the first vision. All of these things were predetermined.
Yeah,
Um, and from a Christian standpoint, this is very much a Calvinist or Reformed position that God has already predetermined everything,
yeah,
because he has absolute foreknowledge, and so everything will occur because it's his will, and so that means both good and evil. Whatever happens in the world is because God predetermined it to be so. Uh, to his glory, basically, is
yeah.
kind of how it would be said. But that doesn't seem to fit a Latter Day Saint perspective very well at all, because we have
Agreed.
such a heavily we are so heavily in favor of libertarian free will. It is replete. Our scriptures are replete with this idea that God gives us moral agency to
Yeah,
choose.
yeah,
And I think it would be obvious to any Latter Day Saint, but to anybody who's not a Latter Day Saint who comes across this episode, and we're talking about free will and how it's compatible with foreknowledge or predeterminism. Um, how exactly, as a Christian, can we truly choose to enter into a relationship with our Father in heaven? How can we choose to repent and accept Christ as our Lord and Savior, um, if we did not actually have some degree of free will? I don't see how that could be, because you would have to take the position that um, God made you in some respect. He basically forced your hand uh, to repent or to accept Christ as your savior. That you didn't really have any say in the matter. He's going to make things occur in your life, even down to your own brain chemistry and how you think and conceive things in your own mind, that would allow you to believe in him. And so um, you would basically have to take away free will if you were to understand that God has predetermined everything. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That we could have free will if God's predetermined everything with absolute foreknowledge. And I know that there are much more intelligent individuals out there who could argue against that. Um, but I think brass tacks comes down to this kind of dichotomy of free will and predeterminism. It's just doesn't seem to fit. And Latter Day Saints, obviously, um, because we believe so much in this libertarian free will, we can't believe that God would force us into a relationship with Him. It has to be our choice. And
yeah. I
um,
think. Oh yeah, sorry. Go ahead and
no, go
finish.
ahead.
Well, yeah. So I think that. So I probably would not like fully committed to libertarian free will, because libertarian free will is, I mean, I think more or less a philosophical position, and it's not, you know, it's not like Joseph Smith was like working out a philosophical position. That being said, I think given the way that we talk about agency in the church, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that the kind of latent understanding of free will is a libertarian one. That's, I would say that, yeah, most members of the church and most leaders of the church, and most church intellectuals in history have kind of tacitly presupposed something like a libertarian conception of free will, especially with the kind of principle of alternative possibilities. You have to be able to have done otherwise to count as being free. That's a really big part of the way that we think about moral agency, right? That you could choose the good or the bad, right? And so, yeah, I think that's like kind of tacit. I mean, that by itself doesn't necessarily mean, as likely to think, you have to be a libertarian, right? Sometimes we can have tacit understandings without that being true, right? Like, I think, again, we have a tacit understanding that God has absolute foreknowledge, but Brigham Young didn't believe that, right? So, there's kind of complicated libertarian intuitions. They're going to think that if you're, so I guess there's two types of determinism we should be aware of. There's causal determinism, where you think that the state of, something like particles in the universe plus the laws of nature determine what's going to happen. And there's theological determinism, where God is choosing what happens, right? So you could think that kind of God sets up the universe and then lets it go. But then again, like, if God set it up in a certain way and causal determinism is true, it's not really even clear like how far causal and theological determinism come apart, right? It looks like God still decided what would happen ultimately, because he set the particles up in a certain way and the laws of nature such a certain way, and it went from there, right? So,
Right.
but I think, like, yeah, no, go ahead.
Yeah, it would follow that if God sets up the universe in a particular way when he creates it, that
It looks like it, right?
everything essentially flows from that decision. And so you would still have to say at some point that it all goes back to God causing it to be so.
Yeah, I think so. If you're, yeah, I think many people are going to absolutely think that's just totally clearly true. So if you're a compatibilist, you might try to resist by saying something like, what it is to be free is for you to be the source of your actions. So if someone else another agent forces you to do something, you're not free. But if, like, the causal antecedents of history just determine what's going to happen, that's not incompatible with freedom, because you're still the source of your actions. And so then that might look like, if you're a compatibilist and a theist, you can pull apart theological and causal determinism a little bit, because you might think, if God kind of takes over your body and makes you do something, that's not compatible with freedom. But if he sets up the universe in such a way that you're still the source of your actions, but it couldn't have been otherwise, in some sense, it couldn't have been otherwise, then you're still free. But I think many people are going to think that's just kind of tendentious, that it's not, that's not really what we mean by freedom, right? So that's the kind of standard response to compatibilism. People think that's just not, it's not clear that's what we have in mind when we say people are free. So I think there are ways to pull apart theological and causal determinism, but I think you're right that many people are going to think it doesn't matter. If God sets up the universe at the beginning of time in a certain way and everything follows from that, God determined what I'm going to do. And it's not clear that I'm free to choose to reject him or accept him, because it was already settled. It was a settled matter when he set up the beginning of the universe, whether or not I would accept him. And he chose whether that would happen by determining, the way that the individual particles and laws of nature were set up or whatever. So I think I think many people are going to agree with you that if creation ex nihilo and causal determinism are true, then theological determinism is also true, and we're not free, right?